This is my third design analysis video now. The previous videos have been really well received. I've gotten super positive feedbacks from you all. I have just graduated with my game design degree last month. If you want to see my design skills in action, the free demo of my very first solo game project is releasing on Steam today. I'd really appreciate you checking it out. Please also consider wishlisting my game on Steam. It helps with the algorithm. Now we'll move on to the video. Westwood Studios was known for setting ambitious design goals and putting fun at the forefront. We have Westwood to thank for pioneering the real-time strategy genre via Dune 2. Their Command & Conquer franchise then popularized the RTS genre to a mainstream audience. Command & Conquer Red Alert 2 certainly stands out among these classic titles. It's what first sparked my interest in video games. Many of us have grown up watching our relatives play it, and if you're at a brown dinner party, Red Alert 2 is an infallible conversation topic, even if you're talking to someone who's not an avid gamer. Since its top of the charts debuts in the year 2000, Red Alert 2 has been a beloved title for millions of people all over the world. In this video, I wish to break down the Allied campaign of Red Alert 2 and examine its beat-to-beat gameplay through the lens of level design principles, hopefully to uncover some factors that contributed to Red Alert 2's international success. Let's see whether this 2-decade-old game really is the masterpiece as we remember it, and how well it measures up to modern RTS games. I am doing the Allied campaign this time, but if you would like to see more videos like this, leave a comment below. I might do another design analysis for the Soviets campaign of Yuri's Revenge next time around. Also, a very special thanks to the Red Alert 2 YouTuber TG, who provided some of the gameplay footages shown in this video. Let's get started. We'll first take a moment to point out a specialty of the Command & Conquer franchise: live-action cutscenes. While most modern RTS titles settle for a CGI animated cast, there is a special kind of charm to the CNC cutscenes. These cutscenes enhance the realism of an alternate World War II setting and the immersion of being a battlefield commander. That, when combined with the talents of the actors, really packs an appeal. At the start, the player is informed that he is the last surviving commander in the midst of a Soviet invasion. This kind of responsibility sure adds to the power fantasy many RTS players crave. We're introduced to Special Agent Tanya. She is established as charismatic, capable, and has little regard for authority. This adds some welcoming context, as we'll be controlling her during the mission. As the mission starts, we get the iconic imagery of the Statue of Liberty under siege. In enters Tanya, whom we will order to sink the Soviet dreadnoughts one by one. This was a brilliant intro to the game for many reasons. The game eases the player in by offering only one unit to start off. Attaching explosives to dreadnoughts is a clever tutorial in disguise, which first teaches the player the basic unit selection, movement, and attack inputs, then gets us to repeat the actions on 3 other dreadnoughts as to get comfortable with the controls. While the repetition of such simple actions may appear boring to veteran players, there exists a challenge of how fast the player can carry this out, under the assumption that the Statue of Liberty could be saved. It is common to see other RTS campaigns start off at a remote location, for very good reasons. A new player may easily be overwhelmed by large-scale engagements. Plus, a learning environment should be a safe environment. Red Alert 2 defies that idea by starting on a high note, throwing the player right into the middle of action without suffering its design repercussions. While the player is dealing with impressive-looking Tier 3 dreadnoughts straight away, these artillery units have no capability for close combat. Sure checks the box of safe learning environment. Plus, Red Alert 2 is taking advantage of its OP commando unit, so that the game can get away with throwing hordes of enemies at the player right off the bat. Making a good first impression is crucial. That's why you often see movies with epic opening sequences. Many RTS games sacrifice such a first impression for the sake of teaching. What Red Alert 2 did right was to have a high intensity, low difficulty opening. There are missiles flying around and being intercepted, troops delivered via transport and paradrop, a strong sense of urgency as Lady Liberty gets bombarded, all the while without exposing the player to any real danger. Now that the player has demonstrated their basic understanding of the game's controls, they get to do some target practice on these paratroopers. You might say the lack of any actual danger renders this segment without any stake. But the player does need to act quickly to ensure the survival of these GIs, who are now among the player's ranks. Let's also note that this level is set at a memorable, recognizable landmark. Now that the player has overcome the initial challenge, this triumphant moment is immediately snatched away from the player, as a rocket coming from the side tears the statue down. It's a story point that's bound to leave an impression. Now that the player is used to controlling Tanya, the game assigns a group of units for the player to control next. But before that, you're presented with the little problem that the GIs are deployed. The player needs to figure out how to activate the unit's special ability, which will be crucial throughout the rest of the campaign. In level design, this is called a skill gate. Skill gates are blockers that make sure the player understands a mechanic before letting the player proceed. In this case, until the player has learned how to undeploy the GIs, they're literally unable to move forward. GIs are possibly the best units the devs could have chosen for a non-arbitrary skill gate. A quick criticism. The relevant tutorial info here was only temporarily displayed in the corner. The player could easily have missed it during the actions. It'd have been a good idea to keep such information framed at a salient spot and kept visible. But of course, the devs had the UI constraints which prevented them from doing so. Now we select multiple units and learn to move them around through a quiet, hazard-free alley. It's a welcoming learning break after the intense opening. Also a quick Easter egg. If you got Tanya to swim off to the side, you'd find a whole cluster of bonus crates. It's always nice to encourage exploration. Back to our main path. As soon as you get on the high ground, a police car races past to the right, drawing your attention to groups of enemies about to overtake two GIs. A car also blows up, just so you know where to look. It's another practice session for moving and attacking, this time with more units under your control. And if you dispose of the enemies fast enough, you'll have 2 surviving GIs to add to your roster. A neat reward. After this engagement, we're presented with a split path. Of course, the city needs a network of streets to look believable, but how will the player know which way to choose? Well, the intended path is much wider, which people will intuitively take. Another police car also shows up and goes in that direction. But if you opted to take the narrow path, you'll find a dead end and another bonus crate. Following the wide road, we come up to an intersection with the Burger Kong! Up until this point, all the buildings we walked past were burning, hence ungarrisonable. Now you're standing next to this restaurant that perfectly stands out, as a million paratroopers hop out of planes and slowly descend towards the ground. What would you want to do? Put your guys into that conspicuous structure, of course. Hence, the player is taught how to garrison buildings, what garrisoning does, and the fact that Tanya cannot be garrisoned. At this point, we've got pretty close to the abandoned base we're told to reach. The shrouds are removed around the base, presenting a clear goal, so we knew the general direction we were meant to head in this entire time. Also, there were 3 conscripts standing to the right earlier, just to guide us closer to our destination. Right before entering the base though, you could take another detour and acquire 3 tanks. A very cool reward, since we haven't seen a single tank up until this point. Once we enter the base, we get a congratulatory message from Lieutenant Eva, and receive the final objective, to destroy the local Soviet base and get revenge. As the final destination is revealed, we see a broken bridge in our path. Now comes another skill gate. We need to construct a barracks, then train an engineer to repair the bridge. Base building in RTS can often be overwhelming to new players, so we're given an already established base here, with barracks being the only thing to be built. Signifiers of red and green tiles indicates where we can place the barracks. Then a quick icon flash gets us to click on the engineer. And we've got the gist of how to build a base and train units. As to not make the wait boring, more paratroopers will come and harass our harvester, so that the player has something to deal with during this slower segment. We already saw paratroopers drop in earlier, so their arrival would be expected. You might also apply the prior knowledge of garrisoning to secure this choke point. Of course, because the base comes with a good number of base defenses, the player will never be in any real danger. Plus, it's an introduction to defending your base. We also see rocket launchers firing constantly at civilian structures. The player's buildings are never threatened, but this adds anticipation to the wait. Upon crossing the bridge, Tanya gets to slaughter a cluster of conscripts. Right after the bloodshed, you'd probably want to continue firing as this other cluster. A cluster of explosives. Eva also chimes in with an audio message in case the player doesn't figure out to attack the explosive barrels. Once you do, you see the barrels blow up in the chain reaction, setting some conscripts on fire. Now you know how barrels work. Another criticism for this mission. Immediately after the fun of blowing barrels up, you see more barrels next to each of those sentry turrets. In any mission other than this one, barrels would have destroyed whatever structures nearby. But there's this intuitive inconsistency, where the sentry turrets would barely receive a scratch from the barrels, and would kill Tanya if confronted directly. The likely reason for this design decision is that the devs want to first entice you to go to the turrets, then teach you that despite all of her power, Tanya should never approach a base defense, which forces the player to look for an alternative. This lesson would be taught via a code game over screen. Trials and errors usually aren't a good way of teaching, unless you are playing a rage game. Even though missions do have autosaves, losing at such a late stage would still feel frustrating and unfair. How could the player have known that the turrets are deadly, after they've effortlessly removed all enemies thus far? Sure, you saw some pillboxes in action back at your base, but these runt things don't resemble Soviet turrets one bit. As is apparent, this final objective presents multiple approaches. You could attack from the front by amassing GIs from your barracks, or use the 3 grizzly tanks if you want them. Or you could sneak Tanya to the less defended back end of the base. Notice how some shrouds are subtly cleared, revealing a conscript coming from that way for you to fight, ultimately leading you towards the secondary entrance. Despite the known danger on one end and shrouds of unknown on the other, the player is presented with an informed decision here, as the narrower routes plus the warehouse subconsciously suggest that this way is for sneaking past the guards. If the player hasn't taken any bonus paths until now, they'll see some bonus crates for the first time that come with a tutorial message. Also, see all those rocket launchers that have been pestering you? Having lost Lady Liberty to those guys earlier, you'd probably want to take a shot at them. Even if the player ignores the launchers to the side, there will be 3 very low health launchers right ahead. Once you order Tanya to attack them, you'll learn that Tanya barely does any damage to vehicles. After having her one-shot all infantries and attaching C4 onto ships, this weakness of hers would come as unexpected, so the devs wanted to let the player discover it here and now. And in Yuri's Revenge, Tanya is changed to be able to blow up vehicles, which fixes this logical inconsistency. Now that you've infiltrated the backline, you get to alternate between blowing up buildings and cleaning up conscripts. You also observe that those statue thingies are the Soviet counterpart of barracks. Overall, the ending segment combines all the skills you've learned so far and offers a satisfying, destructive celebratory round. Speaking of celebrating a mission accomplished, you get a cheer sound effect and cheering animations. Look at those good boys! My precious, precious good boys! Here is a view of the entire mission map and the path the player could have taken. As an introductory mission, it has a simplistic and straightforward main path, where tutorial segments cannot be missed. Multiple bonus paths are sprinkled throughout to add more fun for veteran players, or in case a player does stray from the intended path. Then in the end, the players give an agency over how they want to finish things off. I charted out a flow diagram for this mission. The perceived intensity of each gameplay beat is represented by the red line, while the expected difficulty is represented by purple. Ideally, a game level should start off easy, then gradually increase in difficulty as the player warms up or learns more. However, a level's difficulty shouldn't simply be an upward slope, because players will need downtimes periodically to not become fatigued. Hence, it's generally a good idea to have gaps between the gameplay segments, and to decrease difficulty right before a climax to prepare the player for the upcoming challenge. With that philosophy, you'd end up with wave-like difficulty curves that elevate over time, which is exactly the case for this mission. You also observe that the intensity of encounters dip or disappear altogether to accommodate the more complex learning segments, with the exception of the action-packed opening, which, as we discussed earlier, was entirely risk-free and meant for preliminary teaching. Tutorials for RTS games are among the hardest to handle, due to the complexity of the genre. For a game released in 2000, Red Alert 2 pulled off its tutorial surprisingly well. Mechanics and systems were broken down and incrementally introduced to the player. Players only receive relevant information when it's needed, and get to digest everything through non-arbitrary gameplay. I'll bet most of you didn't even realize you were being taught while playing this mission. Now, Red Alert 2 does have a separate tutorial mode, which was well done, relatively entertaining, and rewarding thanks to the Easter eggs.
Now is not the time for potty breaks, Commander.
However, most of us probably never went through those before jumping into the campaigns. It's a good thing that Red Alert 2 did not rely on the training camp. Instead, it let us figure things out as we play, with minimum explicit tutorials involved. It is no wonder that Red Alert 2 gained popularity among people of all ages across the globe, despite the general inaccessibility of the RTS genre. Now we'll finally move on to the second mission. We're introduced to the enemy commander, General Vladimir. It's nice to have some personality attached to the AI enemy, so that the player doesn't feel like they're just interacting with computer codes. We get more character building for Tanya. Then we're off to reclaim an airbase that's been captured by the Soviets. There is actually a bit of meta-level progression shown during each mission's loading screen. The loading time tends to be brief, so most of us likely never paid attention to those. But a map indicates where each mission takes place and sheds light on the bigger picture revolving the war. In the first mission, we were fending off initial invasion forces around the US borders. By this time, however, we see that the situation is perilous as the Soviets have made significant progress. We are indeed the lone guardian, while the rest of the world is reluctant to offer interference. Makes the player feel significant, eh? We're greeted with a snowy landscape, a beautiful change of scenery. We start off with the familiar units we've handled in the previous mission, around a cozy campfire. It's a nice way to ease the player in, but we quickly encounter a problem. A tank shows up. We can combine all the strategies we'd utilized in the previous mission. Let Tanya shoot at it, garrison the GIs, to no avail. The previously effective strategies have become obsolete. We'll need something new. The tank specifically targets Tanya. If you haven't realized that Tanya sucks against vehicles, you should now, as Tanya is at death's door and you're hopelessly failing this mission. A group of racketeers fly in for the rescue. What a nice way to introduce a new unit. You see that they can scale over terrains. The player's immediate reaction now is to target down the pursuing tank, which teaches the player that those bulky tanks are powerless against air units. The crisis has been averted, and you've learned what situations those new racketeers are good for. Then you receive a reward for your effort, and get some breathing room after making it out in the clutch. You can also explore the map a bit and find some veteran racketeers freezing to death. Why don't they just take off? A bit ahead, you get to exercise what you've just learned. Another Rhino tank sits ahead. Racketeers are faster, and would have spotted it before Tanya isn't injured. A new player would have ample amounts of time to figure out, oh yeah, let's get the Racketeers to shoot down that tank and clear a way for Tanya. You'll now see that Racketeers are able to fly over water. Once the Racketeers have directly approached the airbase, they're confronted by flak cannons. Those upward-pointing cannons should visually communicate their anti-air row, as well as the fact that they cannot target ground. If you don't pull back Racketeers right away, you'll get to learn about their weakness the hard way. No worries, there's tons of Racketeers, so losing a few isn't the end of the world. Just a reminder that the immediate objective here is to get engineers into the airbase. There are sentry turrets at every corner. We've learned to not approach them in the previous mission. With a lake blocking the way, engineers cannot enter the base without getting killed. This is where the level puts your learning to test. We've figured out that Racketeers can counter ground, but flak cannons are preventing their advance. What should be done? Thinking back to what we've previously learned, Tanya can swim. She's the only one that can avoid the sentry turrets, kill some conscripts, and then blow up the flags from the inside. Now we apply our new knowledge and kill the turrets using Racketeers, which Tanya cannot approach. Problem solved! And this clever scenario has got us to coordinate an attack using different unit types, each covering up for one another's weakness. That's a crucial skill to possess when playing an RTS game. The mission up until this point has been a fantastic testament of the level designer's expertise. A desirable approach to introducing a new mechanic is to first teach it, offer practice, then present a challenge surrounding it. We first learned that Racketeers can kill ground targets unscathed. We got exercise by removing another tank farther up. Then we were challenged at the base entrance, where we must circumvent the vulnerability of Racketeers. StarCraft 2's campaign is generally recognized as the best single-player RTS experience ever created. One of its quirks is that each mission is designed to not only showcase a new unit's strengths, but also expose its shortcomings. A decade before the release of StarCraft 2, it's delightful to see Red Alert 2 do the exact same thing. To celebrate your progress, you get the satisfaction of capturing all the structures. You've entered an engineer into a bridge before? You know how this is done. In case you've lost the previous engineers due to any oversight, more engineers are paradropped. To add icing to the cake, you get the celebratory cutscene. We've reached the point where this mission introduces you to the Grizzly tank. You've witnessed the power of tanks, and you can now build your own. Because of the many new unit types you suddenly have to build and manage, this level skips the base building phase altogether, and simply lets you browse through the new build options from the get-go. Now comes a lengthy period of peace where you build up an army while waiting to go on offense when you see fit. It's a neat time for the player to get familiar with unit training at their own pace. In the previous mission, our attention had been drawn to our harvester when it got harassed. Now, you get more opportunities to observe Harvester's mining operation. The miner will drive through the entrance you took to draw your attention, then go all the way around to a field of ores within your vision range. Aside from that, a large ore field is revealed right beside the smaller field, with ore mine drill thingies in its center. This enables the player to compare the two types of ore fields side by side, seeing that the smaller field gradually depletes, while the larger one replenishes itself due to the fact that it has trails. Furthermore, a gate blocks the base exit right between the ore field and your refinery. It's got a Soviet outpost and a waving red flag, signifying that it wouldn't open up for your units. Because this isn't where you entered from, it takes some intentionality to destroy that gate. The player learns about creating short mining paths in the process. Also, hopefully, as the player tries building some of each new unit, they'd have made more ore collectors. The player might then observe their increased income rates and understand the need to establish a stable economy. It might have been helpful to have some form of tutorial on the importance of building harvesters, but it is so viscerally satisfying to mow the lawn by picking up golden ores that players are likely to get more harvesters for that task. Plus, the visible depletion of ores going directly into your bank is quite intuitive for casual players to grasp. This is something Red Alert 3 sacrificed, where new players fail to associate ore nodes with how fast they're earning cash, and hence don't know to expand. You can watch my analysis of Red Alert 3's economy system to learn more about its merits though. Remember how this mission is about rescuing an airbase, so the special feature here, as you'd expect, are air units. While you wait around for your army to assemble, you can mess around with those planes already given to you, and bombard enemy tanks sitting outside. It's more practice for utilizing the air advantage. If you didn't actively partake in this exercise, a single rhino might come knocking at your door. It's not much of a threat, just a call for your air units. You can fly around to explore the map. You can also do some harassments on enemy harvesters that work quite close to your base exit. As you utilize your air units more and more though, you're again reminded that they aren't one size fits all. Introducing flak tracks. They quite literally look like flak cannons on wheels, so you know to keep racketeers away from them. If you do lose quite a few racketeers, you'd receive a reinforcement of more racketeers, just to account for some players being less skilled. Breaking into the Soviet space is a final challenge on everything you've learned thus far. You clear up rhino tanks on the way using racketeers, then you apply the philosophy of how you reclaimed the airbase earlier and get your tanks to kill the unguarded flak tracks, while racketeers are kept a distance away. The unit types introduced here already allow for a counter system, which you can strategize around by sending the right units at corresponding enemy types. As you go up to the front entrance, you can overwhelm the sentry turrets like you did in the first mission, this time using the tank army that's the fruit of your harvest. Or, again thinking back to the first mission, you might try flanking around. Come to think of it, this mission shares a lot of similarities with the first mission. It's certainly building off of what the player's already comfortable with. Towards the right, you'll find explosive barrels that grant Tanya access to wreak havoc. Racketeers could be used for the same purpose, straight up ignoring the walls. There's even a back door opening, so that you can take out all the power plants. With the flak cannons offline, Racketeers can clear the front defenses uncontested. Provided that the player hasn't learned about base power up until this point, It's fair that this is only a more obscure alternate approach that add to replayability, should you decide to revisit this mission after acquiring that knowledge. There are many approaches to reign upon this base, plenty space to think of tactics, using confrontational or sneaky playstyles. And if you took out the flak cannons, a paradrop would come in, making for a blazing victory celebration. The paradrop can also be used to the advantage of speedrunners. Gotta accommodate all player types? Here are the paths the player could take. This map has a vast wilderness to be explored, though the main path is simple enough. As we look at the flow diagram for this mission, I'd like to highlight the variety of gameplay beats. You can see that the player is required to attack with air and ground units interchangeably. These attacks are targeted at different enemy types, and in between the 4 instances where the player attacks rhino tanks using racketeers, there was inserted the economy building segment. It is evident that the designers went out of their way to avoid clustered gameplay, so that player actions don't feel repetitive. New units were gradually introduced one by one. The player also gets to take on enemy encounters at their own pace. You could always cool down a bit after each mini skirmish. Now let's address the post-mission screen. After each mission, the player is shown their current rank as well as some stats. This is an extra pat on the shoulder and offers a sense of progression between missions, as the player character climbs up the military ladder. I'd also like to point out how generous the par times were. The game certainly has a casual audience in mind, and presents appropriate time-based challenges that novices can realistically aim for. Anybody can participate in trying to beat the par time, which encourages efficiency among all players. There are no actual rewards involved, so that people are solely driven by intrinsic motives for improvement, without feeling pressured to play at a pace beyond their comfort zone. Over to the third mission, we're greeted by the President and General Carville, both having now become Soviet supporters. It's comical, and we're given the responsibility to save those important individuals. It's here that we're introduced to the true villain of the story, the bot psychic megalomaniac known as Yuri, who has planted a local psychic beacon to mind control the region. This is actually the only time we catch a glance at the big bad. Maybe Yuri's only meant to be someone operating behind the veil, so that the player needs to play the Soviets campaign to uncover his side of the story. Plus, having your units actually get mind controlled could be pretty darn frustrating. The world map indicates that the Soviets have advanced further in their conquest, and we're heading to Washington DC to escort the president out of there. We're given another change of scenery. This is a nighttime operation. From the get-go, we're introduced to a new unit type, the IFV. IFV has the unique gimmick of modifying its functionality depending on the infantry put inside it. Visual tutorials tend to speak louder than words, so the game simply shows us this process. As a GI and an engineer, each enters one IFV, so that the 3 different IFV forms are seen side by side, with clear visual cues signifying their functionalities. We also see an engineer IFV repairing another vehicle, which will help with army sustainability as we go on long-distance assaults in this mission. Beyond that, this is the first mission to require actual base building from the ground up. That's some seriously incremental onboarding right there. We've had preliminary interactions with the build interface in the past 2 missions, so the player should be equipped to face the challenge now. We start with an already unpacked MCV, just to skip that extra step and give the player what they've already worked with in the past. The tech tree of Red Alert 2 is also quite user-friendly, with only immediately available build options displayed on the side. How hard can it be to click on that single dot's power plant icon under the only category? While we wait for buildings to construct, let's take a look at the starting area and what it communicates. Some ores are exposed, so we know where we'll be placing our refinery. We're surrounded by water. There's only one obvious direction to explore in. Heading in that direction, we'll find some colorful gems. They're placed among golden ores with which they share the same shape, so we're led to assume they're an ore variant. The player might also grasp gem ore's higher value, although that's less well communicated. From the starting position, the entire left side of your MCV is covered with ores that obstruct building placements, while the right side is taken by your starting units. So where would the player be likely to place their first power plant? The broad open area under the MCV, of course. That area directly connects to this empty parking lot between apartments. A perfect spot for refinery placement. Hence, the players naturally like to prioritize collecting the gems. and has uncovered the base crawl mechanic, as they stretch out their initial 3 buildings. For those who don't know, base crawl refers to how you gain additional build radius around structures you've placed. As the gems entice you to scouts farther down the lane, you'll find the choke point that is the entryway into your base. Those 2 bridges. You started off with a massive army of GIs, and there are ample garrisonable structures near the bridges, so the player would figure out to garrison GIs for defensive purposes. This map is laid out in a way that defending your base and economy is super straightforward. Remember that at this stage, the player is meant to focus on treading the unknown territory of base building, so neither offense nor defense should be much of a distraction. You could actually just destroy those bridges altogether, although that mechanic is less discoverable. If you did, you'd only be pestered by some occasional infantries coming from underneath. Those infantry squads come pretty early on, and are made up of mind-controlled civilians, suits the narrative backdrop, does not pose much of a threat, and gives your GI form IFV a showcase of its anti-infantry firepower, which is pretty horrible. The lengthy wait time between buildings naturally leads the player to scout the surroundings, identify economic sources, and secure defensive positions. This is a huge component of early game activities in all RTS games, which this mission taught to the player in a very intuitive way. And hey, you even discover a hospital. Now you know to capture neutral structures, a skill that will be reinforced by bonus objectives later on. Up until now, I've never understood why Red Alert 2 requires Airfield Command Headquarters to unlock your radar minimap. Not having a minimap early on is such a pain point. But I now realize that this is what the designers were counting on. Players would always aim to get airfield up ASAP, which actually is the tier 2 requirement. The game is helping the player navigate the tech tree unknowingly, and if your airfield goes down, you lose the minimap, so you'll be in a hurry to rebuild it, all the while regaining tech access. This is the first time the player has to incrementally unlock build options, so there's got to be ample incentives in doing so. The first enemy base immediately outside has an obvious weakness. It has no anti-air. The player will be led to exploit that weakness using tier 2 racketeers. Note that each enemy base comes with its own ore field. Given how fun it is to capture enemy buildings, players are likely to gain build radius there, then set up a refinery for those ores. A nice way to teach base expansion. Given the map size, you might also be prompted to produce vehicles from this forward base. It is around this time that the player encounters a new enemy type, Tesla Troopers. Tesla Troopers are described as heavy anti-armor infantries. You observe their capability as they attack your new base that's far from your garrisons. The player might be led to counter them by putting more GIs into IFVs. Neither IFV nor Tesla Trooper will have significant gameplay impacts, since once again, lessons in offense aren't this mission's design focus. Toying with IFVs merely provides something refreshing, as you rely mostly on the army composition that worked well in the previous mission. The player is kept inside the territory they're accustomed to, as they tackle the intricacies of base building. The player will periodically be given reinforcements, even if they'd be neglecting army production. The reinforcements also come from far sides of the map, so that if the player had been turtling inside their base extensively, they'll have something exciting to do. That is to get the reinforcements safely into their base, while avoiding enemies along the way and discovering what's on the other side. Now comes the side objectives. Some landmarks of the city are reviewed through the shrouds. They act as beacons to guide your approach to your final objective, while also giving you goals to aim for, as the psychic beacon is hidden somewhere in the city. Back at the very beginning of this mission, we saw a broken monument with an engineer standing next to it. The player may have entered the engineer in for repairs, which then grants some money crates. This serves to enhance the discoverability of those bonus objectives. The repair side quests encourage the player to pack along engineers into IFVs, fulfilling transport and army repair purposes. The mission also feels more special, when in addition to reclaiming a ruined city, you are also gradually restoring the city's features. Gameplay-wise, the Lincoln Memorial is guarded by tanks, so it's best approached by air. The Washington Monument is guarded solely by flak trucks, so you can't use air there. The Natural History Museum is lightly guarded by infantry, but has its path blocked by a garrison, so you might coordinate ground and air attacks. The main base only has one flak cannon, so most of the peripheral sentries are vulnerable to airstrikes. Like I said, this mission tuned down the tactical complexity on offense while widening its spatial layout. When you discover the psychic beacon, you'll see that it's guarded by sentry turrets and flak cannons. A decently sized tank army will tear it down easily. Though you might also discover the fact that IFV rockets can launch over walls. Then, a helicopter escorts the president and his bodyguards out of the White House, and you get his gratitude. This map starts off on an island, and has its paths diverge once you cross the bridge. It's a pretty open-ended hunt for the hidden psychic beacon. The top left is a dead end. The middle path is the shortest, most obvious, but also most difficult to get through. There's an additional sneakier right path with sparse enemy encounters. Each of the 3 lanes consists of a landmark for a side objective, while 2 of them converge at the beacon destination. This is a low difficulty level, bridging the gap between army control and other activities of the skirmish mission format. The bulk of the challenges at the beginning learning phase, exploration and expansion come in the middle. Some exciting encounters, reinforcements and side quests are sprinkled here and there to compensate for the mission's slow-paced nature. Mission 4 is up next. The American leaders have been relocated up north to Canada. The Soviet side has a funnier take on this instance. Anyways, General Vladimir has struck Chicago and established a psychic beacon about to mind control yet another city. Since the previous mission revolved around the psychic beacon, we understand the narrative reason for crossing Lake Michigan and destroying the beacon before it comes online. The mission starts by introducing the basics of naval combat. We shoot down a couple stationary baguette cannons to learn about naval destroyers' capability of attacking land targets. In easier difficulty settings, you are also given rocketeers to safely take down the cannons. This is an easier part, taking advantage of previously acquired knowledge to ease the player in. Immediately after the engagement, you meet a Typhoon attack sub, and witness destroyers' ability to attack with their Osprey bombers when their main gun cannot hit submerged units. You meet another sub to reinforce the learning, while also being guided to go left to shore. Applying the knowledge from the Grand Canyon engagement earlier, you now clear the landing by killing sentry turrets and other vehicles. More subs will approach to provide a bigger naval combat challenge. You'll also observe submarines' elusive nature as they disappear when far from destroyers, and can launch surprise attacks on your transports. This segment combines offensive maneuvers in the front and protection of transports on the back end. Even if you lost all destroyers during this encounter, subs cannot threaten your land structures anyways, so not much is at stake. As you release your units out of your transports, you learn that land forces can be carried across bodies of water via amphibious transports. Also, there was a narrower, less noticeable maze of water passages you could have taken, where you only encounter a single high ground turret instead of 2 grand cannons. Rewards the exploration and clever route selection, without compromising the teaching of destroyers targeting land. You'd end up at a less guarded landing spot with an ore field all the same, and get to gradually clear the shoreline from the east end. Destroyers will have difficulty breaking through to the psychic amplifier right away, so you'll likely push them westward to assist in ground combat. There is dynamic difficulty involved here as well. If the player destroys the enemy buildings very quickly, the forward enemy base would get sold off, immediately summoning in some surrounding troops as well. Your starting units are more than enough to fend off the massive attack, but things do get rather dicey. This is a big leap from the defensive actions you'd taken before. But of course, the player could just methodically capture the entire base without triggering sell-off. Some reinforcement units also arrive in the nick of time to assist in the initial defense. Base building wise, you are largely reenacting what you did in the previous mission, this time pulling offensive maneuvers during the downtimes between construction. There is the extra step of deploying your MCV at a desired spot, and the added naval yard build option. The naval units unlocked are the ones you've already been familiarized with. There are 2 main ore fields on both ends of the shore, accommodating whichever landing spots you settle for. Hence, you also get to apply the knowledge of base crawl in order to reach the faraway ore field. Some gem ores can once again be found in the distance away, so that you remember their existence and can intentionally prioritize their harvest. Time pressure is added onto the production process as well. As soon as you deploy your MCV, the psychic amplifier countdown starts, threatening you with a fail state. Given that this is the first timed mission, the time window is very generous, but the mere presence of a timer is enough to push first-time players out of endless turtling, forcing prompt decision-making and more aggressive risk-taking. To break out of your base, you'll first face some Tesla troopers, so that reliance on only tanks won't work that well. Then, to elevate the difficulty, you meet a flak track filled with Tesla troopers, which your racketeers cannot approach, while your tanks also cannot stand ground against. This is where the player transitions from using garrisons for defense to garrisoning on offense. The GIs you started with can deal with the heavy clusters of defenders, sometimes requiring you to lure the enemies over. Once you're well established, the game throws yet another twist in base management. The V3 rocket launcher shows up. These artilleries were first seen in the first mission, but this is the first time an artillery actually threatens your base from a mile away. Design decisions were made to ensure this encounter is fair and manageable for the player. Moments before the artillery strike, a single conscript is sent in to pester you, drawing your attention to that end of your base. This is so that you don't miss the V3 that will soon bombard the exact same location, and the player will observe their functionality. As you go up to confront the V3 with your tanks, you realize that the V3 is protected by a heavily garrisoned structure, so that you have to make use of racketeers. Another V3 encounter will develop off of that. This time, there are 2 of them, while within the range of a flak cannon, so the same racketeer response won't work anymore. The level is getting the player to experiment with multiple ways of responding to V3. The player is also being trained to identify what units are good against which enemy army composition, which, trust me, is about to come in handy. With the V3 introduction out of the way, we'll look at our final objective: destroying the psychic amplifier. The location is surrounded by fully garrisoned structures that will shred approaching tanks. A land approach is rendered impractical, especially since we don't have time to build an infinite-sized army. The air approach we employed earlier also wouldn't work, due to a flak cannon being right at the root of these garrisons. We could try garrisoning GI on offense once more, but our garrison quickly gets gunned down by the insane firepower from the other side. All prior strategies have unexpectedly failed to work. The level is forcing the player to devise something new as the clock ticks. The solution here is to power down the flak cannon. I don't think this is entirely fair. Although the player has become more informed regarding the mechanic of base power since they started managing their own base, most players would not have seen an occasion where base power affects base defenses. Regardless, an enemy base is right next to our attacking path, so most players would take a poke at it. This enemy base isn't easy to swallow either. A garrison prevents tanks from advancing deep inside, while a flak cannon farther off prevents racketeers from firing at that garrison. If the player manages to kill the fairly exposed power plant, a new one will be constructed to force the racketeer retreat. What follows is a sequence of actions, where tanks first kill off both the construction yard and the power plant, then immediately retreat as the enemy garrison gains line of sight. Racketeers then go in and finish off the garrison, clearing way for tanks to advance. The actions are repeated on another garrison to the left. As the player kills more enemy structures, cutting down their power consumption, a flak cannon farther down regains its power, forcing some racketeer maneuvers around the base to destroy the final power plant, which is guarded by another garrison. Alternatively, tanks could be ordered to kill the flak cannon before racketeers head in. We've had some experience with coordinating attacks with land and air units before, but this mission elevates the tactical decision-making to a higher level. At last, with the side base annihilated, the player can head back to the psychic amplifier where the flags are powered down. You apply the same skills by killing the garrisons using air, then blasting down the psychic amplifier with your tank's superior DPS. As the actions come to a close, you are greeted by General Vladimir, who has decided to nuke the city now that he'd failed to mind control it. Narratively, this means all your hard work had gone to waste. Quite a subversion of the usual victory celebration, and it makes for a memorable mission conclusion. Also, if you let the timer run out, you get a special ending where your units become mind controlled. A nice way to make even a mission failure interesting. I have not talked about the naval route you could have gone for this entire time though. If the player chose to embrace this new element of warfare, they'd have bypassed all the carefully crafted challenges we discussed, and missed out on a valuable opportunity to fine-tune their tactics. While there is some room for unit-type cooperation, the naval route is much simpler, which makes sense, given that the player has had little experience with naval combat. Aside from that, there is also a bridge you could repair, which lets you kill a cluster of power plants via tanks alone, grants access to capture neutral structures, and even gives you an army of monkeys.
جهزت الوحدة.
You could argue that these alternate paths offer a needed alternative if a player cannot make it past the enemy defenses on land. Plus, it gives you something else to try out when replaying this mission. Those are the design trade-offs. That said, these are the available paths. While the level seems very open-ended, the secondary and bonus paths are obscure as to offset their low difficulty. Overall, this level serves more as a practice to solidify learnings regarding the skirmish playstyle. The player is challenged by carrying out the same base building process while gradually eliminating enemies along the shore, and being under a time pressure to quickly produce a sizable army. There are multiple difficulty spikes, both with the introduction of defending against artilleries and with advanced offensive combat. Clearing the way to the destination requires methodical planning and combining numerous skills from previous levels. The time limits further challenges the player's mastery of previous learnings, a major leap in difficulty for sure. This next mission 5 picks right back up from the previous mission's narrative outcome. With the city nuked, other allied nations have finally become concerned and joined in on the president's Zunka. As a part of the exchange for foreign aid, Tanya will be sent to Europe to take out 2 nuclear silos that are concerningly close to the German borders, and are the reason for these nations' reluctance to join the war. The premise of this mission is evidence that the separate missions are not disconnected instances. There exists a link running between the missions, as a bigger storyline unfolds. As the European Council expresses their plan to take over command, Tanya starts fighting to get you to oversee this operation. Tanya's defiance and blatant disregard for authority is what makes her character stand out. You may recall that in the past, we were told that Tanya is not an easy person to get along with. She is now risking angering out these prominent political figures because you've earned her trust and respect. That's a heck of a way to give the player recognition. This next mission is a unique one, and before we hop into it, I want to talk about general RTS mission types. Missions can be categorized via many approaches. In this particular case, I'll borrow some terms from the Campaign Design podcast over on General's Gentleman, as well as a single-player RTS analysis written by Josh Spicer. This is how I've categorized the missions up until now. An engaging RTS campaign should alternate between mission types, so that things don't get monotonous, and so that all aspects of a player's competencies are challenged. Stealth missions give you a small number of forces to command discreetly. Puzzle missions require the player to figure out specific solutions. Skirmish missions follow a typical multiplayer format, where you build a base, train units, and win by destroying your opponent's base. Naval missions are a quirk of the Red Alerts franchise and are utilized occasionally to switch things up. We've had 3 consecutive skirmish missions right before to solidify learnings. Tanya has been absent for 2 missions, as focusing on controlling a commando would have distracted from the learning of standard skirmish. So this upcoming mission 5 will be a nice change of pace. The mission commences in a snowy nighttime setting, a combination we haven't seen so far. The environment enforces the somber tone following the nuclear disaster and serves as a reminder that we're now infiltrating Soviet territory. Our units arrive near the border where Soviet troops stand, giving us the opportunity to safely figure out how to disguise our spies. Sus. If you cross the border right away, you'd discover a speed crate. As Eva chimes in to warn us about guard dogs that can detect stealth, a conscript walks in to delay our advance. This is so that we're prepared for the 2 dogs that are following behind him. Dogs are fast-moving units. Having them maul Tanya to death right at their introduction would be disappointing. By getting us to first target the conscript that enters our view, the game teaches us that when Tanya has stopped, she will automatically shoot at nearby targets, hence killing off any approaching dogs. It would have been nice to display tips like press S to stop or hold Ctrl Shift to perform an attack move. Without knowing that, players are gonna have to rely on fast reaction time and clicking precision. New players will die to dogs a lot. This is the first mission where failing is expected. We're entering a new level of difficulty, especially for Tanya operations. That's also due to the fact that you now need to manage spies to work in conjunction with Tanya. As Tanya leads the way, we're again reminded of the functionality of explosive barrels before we're inside danger zones. As the barrels have led us off the main path, we'll be a safe distance away from the dogs that run along the trail. The dogs will briefly stop, giving us the opportunity to practice dealing with them. Given our limited vision range, this mission keeps the player on their toes as they head into the unknown, expecting a dog to pop out at any moment. However, to make things fair, shots get cleared with an alarm sound when we're coming up to a Tesla coil.
On there.
This is where we'll learn about Spy's infiltration mechanic. Plenty conscripts stand still for us to disguise as, and Tanya will have to first clear the dogs that run around the base entrance. Otherwise, we'd lose the spies we send out. The game does account for mishaps at this stage, and would reinforce us with more spies if needed, so that the loss would be a mere setback and not game over. Although before the player knows that, there's quite the tension as the player carefully escorts their spies. Also, if you released those fenced cows, you get the bovine rescued message, and can send the cows to scout around. The devs were really having fun with this. It is only after we've gotten past the gates that the game presents the tutorial info relevant to us next.
If you can get a spy into one of the Tesla generators, you can probably shut down all of the base's power for a good 30 seconds.
Sending a spy into a power plant will disable enemy base power. Tesla coils' visual design clearly communicates this. They look like Soviet generators, so a natural association is formed between the two. You'll clearly know when the Tesla coil is powered down, as their menacing electric arcs disappear. A timer also indicates how long the coils will stay offline for, so we can anticipate when power would be restored and not get zapped out of nowhere. This timer also creates an excellent sense of urgency. As soon as a spy is in position, there's not a moment to lose. We'll need to carry out whatever operation we'd planned within the time frame. A lab immediately comes into view. We need to infiltrate the lab to locate the nuclear silos, so the goal is kept in our sights. That doesn't mean we can simply enter the lab, however, since walls are built around it, exposing only the far side. Dogs patrol this area. You could pose some pulse-pumping stealth action and get in while the dogs are away, or Tanya would need to clear the way. Also, there's another generator up ahead, so even if the player blew up the two generators on their side, then had Tesla coil return online, they aren't soft-locked in the area. There is a hidden path here that's not too obscure. A barrel lies in the middle of nowhere, its sole purpose being to open up a passage up hills. Heading in that direction will reveal some GIs and engineers who are stranded after their plane crashed. They inform the commander to look out for other survivors out there. The engineers offer the player many creative alternatives to approach the remainder of this mission. For example, you could capture a war factory and a refinery to go after those beautiful glowy gems and play this out skirmish style. You could also capture barracks to train more engineers. Once a spy has entered the lab, for the first time in this campaign, our minimap is resized. Eva adjusts our attention to the new nuclear silo coordinates where to head to. Having the map gradually expand makes the map feel more approachable to the player and prevents the player from skipping the introductory bits. The downhill silo presents a twist. The ducks nearby never get far enough away from a Tesla coil for Tanya to safely snipe them. Tanya will have to swim around and find a barrel to blow upside walls with. Then she can get in, kill the ducks from there, and blow a crack in the silo walls. There are no power plants here. This base's different coloration also suggests that infiltrating the red generators from earlier wouldn't impact the Tesla coils all the way up here. So we'll have to leave this one be for now. Once we get farther up hills, we rescue some captured GIs and an elite tank. A power plant is immediately exposed, allowing us to kill the dog inside and sneak in a spy. Now we can turbulently wrap this up and thank the mission for letting us wreck an entire base as a reward. There are more dogs around, so a greater risk also exists. If the player had rescued the two engineers and captured the generator and one of the nuclear silos, Eva would suggest that they could launch a nuke at the other silo. It's yet another fun way to complete the mission. So, this is the first half of the mission. It's a lot more open-ended than the single solution from the front entrance I presented. It nonetheless delays the divergence of paths, so that the player doesn't miss crucial tutorial infos regarding spies. The second half of the mission offers even more freedom and potential for stealth approaches. It is filled to the brim with replayability. Bravo! This is a very tense and memorable mission full of perilous elements where a slip could cause a game over. A lot of the pressure comes from the player's intense focus, as Tanya cautiously ventures into undiscovered terrains, expecting dogs to jump out. Tension is also frequently created by the player, during and immediately after each generator infiltration, where they need to capitalize on the power-off timer. These high-tension stealth segments are spread out and initiated by the player himself, so that they occur at a frequency the player is able to tackle on. Quite a bit of downtime exists between traveling between distant Soviet bases, naturally allowing the player to go down. While the stealth mission is inherently small in scale, the level did not shy away from finishing with a bang and gave the player infantry forces as well as an elite tank to manage simultaneously, making for a spectacular destruction of the third enemy base. Okay, Red Alert 2's campaign is actually pretty long, and this video is already an hour long. I'll have to make this into a two-parter. If this video does well, we'll go over missions 6 to 12 in part 2, where Prism Tank messes everything up. See you around!